Hello friends, welcome to lesson 6 in my bourbon school. And today I'm going to talk about a quite interesting topic. The topic is, of course, as you can see on the screen, it's about peat. What is peated? You may have heard about peated whiskey. And part of that topic is going a little bit in depth of why bourbon and, for instance, Scotch whiskey taste so differently. And to support me in this lesson, I'm actually sipping on a Barterhouse, which is something as rare as a 20-year-old Kentucky bourbon whiskey. So that's very nice. A little bit difficult to get a hold of for reasonable money these days. And very seldom you can actually get a 20-year-old a bourbon whiskey. So let's give it a try. Nice. Oh yeah. Okay, anyway. Cool. So on this topic. So I want you to have a look at these two bottles here on the screen. So they're almost the same, as you'll see in a second, but they are so different. So on the far left, there's a bourbon, and closest to me is a Scotch whiskey, and it's a Scotch whiskey that is very, or rather heavily peated. It's from the distillery called Ardbeg. So if you ever heard about this, they focus primarily on making peated whiskey. And if you try these two, they are so different in the taste that I'm actually willing to bet that the bourbon is closer to rum than it is actually to the Scotch whiskey here. So a significant difference in how they taste. And let's examine, and this is the purpose of this lesson, what exactly is going on. So if we look at the production method, how did they make these two whiskeys? So let's look at these two again. And then, as you can see here, I've listed a number of production methods. So I'm just going to read here from the slide. I mean, they're both made from cereal grains, and they both use malted barley. They're fermented into beer, just like we saw in some of the previous lessons as well. They're distilled twice. They do that in Scotland. They also do that in the US. Ireland is primarily 3 times. And they're both aged in oak barrels by law as well. And they're non-chill filtered. I'm actually having a separate lesson on the non-filtration because it's a little bit of a difficult for me to explain this shortly. It's a very interesting topic, and I'll handle that in a separate lesson. And then they're 5 years old, as it happens, each of them. And the ABV is sort of the same, 46-47, which is 92-94 proof. So very, very similar. But one, of course, is a bourbon whiskey, and the other one is a Scotch whiskey. And they taste miles and miles apart. You wouldn't even think it's the same category of spirits. So what is going on? So actually, if you deep dive into this, and this will be the sort of essence of the lesson here, it's all about the malted barley. And if we expand this malted barley section a little bit, you will see certainly some differences, because on the bourbon, they've used, for this particular bourbon, 4% malted barley. And for the Scotch, since it's a single malt Scotch, 100% malted barley by law. And of course, bourbon, it can even be 0%. It can also be much higher than 4%. Typically, it's in the vicinity of 5 to 10% is my own sort of, what I've seen out there. Technically, it can be up to 49% because, as you know, 41% needs to be corn, but it is very, very rare to find products that have this high malt content. So this is more representative, maybe single digits malted barley for the bourbon and 100% on the Scotch whiskey. And then the second thing is that if you recall from the lesson where I taught about malt and what malted barley is, the malted barley need to be dried at one point. In the US, you primarily use hot air, as I explained in that lesson as well. And in Scotland, for this particular one, if you want to go for the more peated style or smoky style whiskey, which the Ardbeg for sure is, you actually dry that with smoke. And as you'll see in this lesson, when you go into details, which I'm going to do in a second, this is exactly where all the differences in the taste and smelling profile lies. All right. So the conclusion, as you can see here, is it is a malted barley. It's literally the only thing really that sticks out. I totally get it. The bourbon is made in the US. The Scotch here is made in Scotland. But besides that sort of like a geographical change, it is really the malted barley here. And there are 2 areas, as we discussed. One is the amount used, and the other one is sort of the way it's dried, right? And we discussed it previously, as I see here, the amount used is 4% versus 100%. I just want to reiterate that so you can see it on the screen here. It is a significant factor 25x difference here, but it can also be a little bit smaller difference here. But then, of course, when we talk about the way it's dried, the one on the far left, the bourbon, the mold is dried with hot air. But the one next to me, as I talked about before, is dried with smoke, and primarily the smoke from something called peat, which I am going to talk about in a second, which is why you're referring to the whiskey as a peated whiskey. Actually, the peated whiskey is also dried with air, because as you get down to like 15-12% moisture in the barley kernel, sort of the smoke stops connecting to the kernel, so there's no really effect of smoking it, and then they take it all the way to, let's say, 5% if that's what you want, with dry air, just like in the US. So it's a combination in reality here. So what is peat? Yes, so as you can see here on the picture, it looks like earth, dirt or something, but it is in essence decayed vegetation, grass or otherwise. And it's something that has been decayed over a very, very, very long time. So just a couple of fun facts. If you don't know what peat is, I just want to put some things on the screen here. Believe it or not, most of the peat in the world was formed about 10 to 12,000 years ago, which is basically when the old ice age was there. It grows ever so slowly. It's about 1 millimeter, or as you can see, 0.04 inches per year. So actually, sort of the picture you saw on the previous slide here was about 10 centimeters tall, 3 inches or something like that. That actually took 100 years to grow. So something that happens very, very, very slowly. And if you dry peat, if you ever try that, it generates an insane amount of smoke. It really, really generates a lot of smoke if you turn this dried peat on fire. Think about sitting literally next to a bonfire. That's sort of what you're getting out here. And actually, there's a lot of peat in the world. So peat is covering about 3% of the world's land space. But actually, it contains, 35, almost a third, or in fact, a third of the soil-bound, carbon. So it attracts a lot of carbon, this peat. So very, very interesting there. Okay. So what you actually do, I talked about this a little bit when we talked about barley and malted barley. So you actually put this dried peat into a peat kiln, as it's called, because drying is called kilning. And then you basically set it on fire, and it generates this insane amount of smoke. And this smoking runs, it's very, very different from manufacturer to manufacturer. Some do like 8 to 12 hours, some go even up to 30 hours. And you can probably imagine yourself sitting for 30 hours with your clothes next to a bonfire. That clothes, until they get washed, will smell like smoke for almost like forever, right? And it's the same thing that's happening with the malted barley. So it attracts all of these smoke particles. In fact, there's a compound in the smoke called phenols that it sort of attracts, and it sort of sticks to these kernels all the way until it gets, as I said before, the moisture level gets down to 10 or 12%. Then you basically end the smoke, and then you dry it with hot air, because it's faster and also more cheap. So that's what you do. And then there is actually a way to measure the level of peatiness, if you can believe it. So when you drink or smell a Scotch whiskey where there's a lot of smoke, you obviously have a peated whiskey in your hand, and all of that comes from all these phenols being sort of attracted inside the malted barley. And this is despite the fact, as you may recall, the malted barley then goes into a mash that's being cooked into beer, and then it's being distilled into, of course, alcohol. And despite all these massive processes, it retains, the whiskey, a lot of the smokiness from the original barley. And the way that you measure this, so in these phenols here, it's something called ppm, and that's basically parts per million. So how many parts of phenols are there in the whole barley there? And actually, I've put out our good friend here, Artbeck, back in the picture, which is, trust me, guys, this is a very, very heavily peated whiskey. This has about 55 ppm, which is very heavy peated. Bourbon, by the way, has a natural, a little bit of phenol ppm in there, but it's like 0.5 or 1 or something. It is so low that you cannot really smell it or taste it. And then the one next to me, Octomore, which is the most heavily peated whiskey in the world. And this one right here, I believe it's a 07.1 release. It has a staggering 208 ppm. It's insane. I actually had the pleasure, I will say that, to try this whiskey. I'm not a peat guy myself, in full transparency here, but I was fascinated about how smoky it was, and I could actually taste a good whiskey underneath, which was surprising to me. Not something that I would go for a daily sipper for myself, but there are obviously people that absolutely adore this product out there. All right. I will say, just as the final couple of thoughts here, not all Scotch whiskey are peated. So if you want to dabble a little bit into Scotch whiskey, you're a bourbon drinker, for instance, say you want to expand the horizon, you may even have tried an American single malt, and you say, okay, this malting taste is not too bad. I actually like the malting taste, so I want to try something that is not smoked but still malted. Of course, you can get a lot of malted Scotch in whiskey in Scotland that is not peated. And you can see this picture on the screen here, sort of the areas in Scotland. They have their names. I'm not going to go into this. This is a bourbon school after all. But you see there are two areas here that are sort of renowned for their either peatiness or lack thereof. Let's take probably the most famous peated area here. It's called Islay. This is where the most insanely peated whiskey comes from, and they're very, very famous for that. And they probably some of the best manufacturers in the world are their whiskey manufacturers. And then, of course, which is my favorite part of Scotland, Speyside. Of course, you can get smoked and peated whiskey from that area, but it's primarily very low peat or also non-peat at all. I've had a lot of Scotch whiskey that are not peated at all, and that I really liked from Speyside. Sort of the signature from this area is non-peated. So not all Scotch whiskey is peated. So you may want to give it a try if you sort of like the malty taste. And actually, in the reverse, it's exactly the same if we have a look at bourbon. So not all bourbon is unpeated. So believe it or not, there are bourbon products out there that are peated. The one at the very far left here is a little bit difficult to see on the label here. They have very special labels, almost like on a typewriter. This is from Kings County. I believe they're from Brooklyn. I have tried this product, and I'll be completely honest, I did not like it at all. I think it's a weird combination of very peaty, which I don't like in the first place, and bourbon. That combination didn't really speak into me, but I know there are actually people that are very, very impressed with this product. So you may, if you're in a bar and you want to try something really, really different where everything comes together, you may want to give this a try. It's just not for me. And also Cedar Ridge, I mean, as you may remember these guys from previous lessons, they try to dabble into something that is off the beaten path, and I love that about it. I have not tried this product. I did try the Kings County product, so maybe I should give the Cedar Ridge a little try here. So not all bourbon is unpeated. And basically, we come to the end. This was the end of the lesson. So now you know the primary reason why bourbon and Scotch taste so different is in Scotch whiskey, they use almost exclusively malted barley. If it is a single malt, it has to be exclusively malted barley. And then there is the smoke part, especially the smoke from peat. It is a staggering difference. If you ever try to peated whiskey and just want to see what is he talking about here, try it. You can get it at any bar, also in the US. They always have Scotch peated whiskey, and you will see immediately what I'm talking about here. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and see you for the next lesson soon. Thanks. Cheers.